park ranger in Utah says she warned Gabby Petito that she thought her relationship with her fiancé, Brian Laundrie, appeared toxic. Melissa Holes is her name. She had responded to a call about a potential domestic dispute between them while they were on their cross-country trip. She told Deseret News this, quote, "I was imploring with her to reevaluate the relationship," basically saying this was an opportunity for her to find another path to make a change in her life. She went on to say, "It's hard not to second guess myself and wish I said more or wish I had found the right words to make her believe that she deserved more." Police say neither Petito nor Laundrie wanted to press charges after this dispute, and the authorities suggested to separate for the night, that would do it. One in a hotel, one in the vehicle. This raised many questions about potential domestic violence issues. Remember, this 911 call from someone who claims to have seen the couple.
We drove by and the gentleman was slapping the girl.
He was slapping her?
Yes, and then we stopped. They ran up and down the sidewalk. He proceeded to hit her, hopped in the car, and they drove off.
Joining me now is Dr. Judy Ho, a clinical and forensic neuropsychologist. Doctor, good morning to you. No charges filed. When you look at that footage, what are your thoughts about the potential that domestic abuse was taking place?
Well, good morning, Susan. And this is a very, very sad story, but unfortunately also a very common story. In fact, a Washington Post analysis of 4,484 killings of women in 47 major U.S. cities during this past 10 years found that nearly half the women who were killed, about 46%, died at the hands of an intimate partner. So if domestic violence was involved, it's all too common that it does escalate to a point where sometimes people die. When we talk about talking to the individuals who are the perpetrators of the violence, sometimes they let the emotions get the best of them, so they weren't necessarily intending to kill that person, and yet it happens because domestic violence does escalate if it's not treated and dealt with.
What about what you see in terms of how they're both acting? In hindsight, we watch it and we see that Gabby's acting very differently than Brian, crying hysterically, and he's very composed, and she's putting the blame more on herself.
This is a very common pattern between domestic violence partners. Usually the person who is a perpetrator, especially when law enforcement's around, especially when other people are watching, they seem like the composed one. And the person who is actually being hurt is the one who actually takes all the blame on herself. And sometimes that comes from the partner. The partner says, "You're the person who makes me this angry. You are why I do this. I love you so much, I just can't control myself." And they actually start to self-blame, one, to protect the partner, but secondly, also in some ways to protect themselves. Sometimes they're not as well informed about exactly what could happen to them. Sometimes the perpetrator actually threatens that if they tell anybody, that harm will come to their family members. And so obviously we don't know about the details of what happens here, but this is a very common type of interaction that you see between people who have domestic violence history between them.
And conversations with Gabby and her mom increased as the trip is going on and as she was having more troubles with Brian, allegedly, and calling her mom more and texting her mom more, maybe reaching out to say, "Hey, I changed my mind here."
Yes, and I think that this is actually some of the things that it's really hard. Hindsight is 2020. You know, why was she reaching out more? Sometimes this happens when people really realize that this is getting serious and they need to reach out to their social supports and try to get some help, but also they're not being forthcoming about why they're reaching out so much, again, because they're afraid of the perpetrator oftentimes, or sometimes they still care about the perpetrator. And that's what's difficult here. It's really hard to know why that happened, because sometimes the opposite happens. Sometimes all of a sudden the person will not be talking to any of their family and friends, and that's because the perpetrator is controlling their use of devices, saying that they can't call people. And obviously we know that eventually complete silence on her side. There was no communication. But I believe that this was one of her last cries for help, but she was afraid to say why she was reaching out more.
Are the authorities there at the scene trained in terms of what is sort of a mental issue in terms of domestic violence?
Yes, that's such a good question. And I think it really varies so largely by jurisdiction, the local leadership, and what to look for, really making sure that everybody is trained up well. I don't know about this particular region and this particular jurisdiction, but I think that we do need more of that. We need that to be a consistent issue that is being talked about, because here they thought this was maybe a mental health issue. That's very vague. I'm not sure what that means. Clearly,
Right.
she was really out of sorts. But when domestic violence is involved, the key signs are sometimes harder to see, and we need formal training for officials to be able to identify that.
And the park ranger who was at the scene there said that she kind of can't stop thinking about it now and thought when she was at the scene she should have said more, saying, look, I think this is a toxic relationship. Maybe it's time that you break free. And now in hindsight, she says she can't even bear watching this because of what she should have done.
Well, and I really feel for this park ranger. I believe that she really likely did her best at the time to make a sound judgment. But again, sometimes the signs are not as obvious as you would think. And it's also really hard when the partner is saying, well, I know I'm crying, I know I seem distressed, but it's okay. I'm fine. I still want to be with this person. What do you do with that? This is an adult with agency. And so I think sometimes when people don't know the history, they tend to leave people alone. And that's also part of the American culture, right? We kind of believe that people have agency and make decisions on their own, whereas maybe in some other cultures where it's much more of like a group or community mentality, more collectivistic in nature, there would just be so many people having eyes on a certain couple that eventually something would have been done. I mean, it's really hard, again, with the hindsight of 2020, and I do feel for this park ranger, but it's very hard to identify these signs, number one. And number two, sometimes the victims, they insist that they're okay. They insist it's their fault. They insist they want to stay with their partner.
Yeah, we hope that more training is in the future, whether it's happening or not. They will have their eyes open in terms of training. Dr. Judy Ho, thank you for your expertise on this. Appreciate it. And I do want to stress Brian Laundrie has not been named a suspect in this case, and he's not charged with